I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video.
What is English paper piecing? Not only is it a great way to use up your scraps, it's a great way to play with your fabrics to make these amazing patterns. In this quilting tutorial, I'll show you the basics and the supplies you'll need to get going. I'll have my favorite tips, including how to make a quilter's knot, and there's some free downloads to share. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. And please support this channel by hitting that subscribe button. English paper piecing, or EPP, is a technique where you wrap fabric around a paper shape and then you sew those shapes together. Not only can you make a quilt out of those shapes, but they can also be used to add texture to a design or hide a couple of imperfections. And it's truly one of the most inexpensive ways to get into quilting, as you probably have everything you need to get started. And you can take it on the go or use it to slow down and relax. Now, before we get started, this video is about English paper piecing, or EPP. Do not confuse EPP with FPP, which is foundation paper piecing. What is the difference between EPP and FPP? EPP is hand sewing, FPP is with your sewing machine. With EPP, you use cardstock. With FPP, you use newsprint. And the results are very different too. EPP is all about a center with symmetrical shapes around them. And FPP is about angles and flipping fabric. If you're interested in foundation paper piecing as well, and you'd like me to make a video about it, please leave a comment down in the notes. English paper piecing is a two-step process. There are many shapes that you can make, but we're going to start with the gateway shape, the hexagon. You grab a hexagon paper, a scrap of fabric, a thread and needle, wrap it around the shape by folding at the corners, and then baste it around the folds to secure the shape. But let's back up a bit. The paper. This is cardstock, and you can make the shapes several different ways. You can print out your shapes and then using paper scissors cut them out. I have a free download on various sizes of hexagons and pentagons from my video English Paper Piece Soccer Ball. I'll leave a link to that in the notes below. You can also use a template to trace your shapes and cut them out. You can also use a punch, which has the advantage of using up old greeting cards and those advertising postcards that fill up your mailbox. You can also purchase pre-cut papers, which is a huge time saver and saves your hands from the stress of cutting. The fabric. This is an ideal place to use up your scrap fabric, but you can use the good stuff too. With your good scissors, you can roughly cut out a shape 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch larger than your paper. Or use a template to mark the cutting line. Or on a small rotary cutting board, you can use a plexiglass template and a 28mm rotary cutter to cut out your shapes. I have also met quilters who don't bother with any of that and just use squares 1/2 an inch larger than the shape, and they don't even bother to trim it.
The last part of the wrapping is the baste.
This is a great place to use up that thread that's on the end of the spool or on the end of your bobbin. And we're using a single strand of thread. The color does not matter. Use whatever sharp needle you have and start with a quilter's knot.
How do I make a quilter's knot? Lay thread across your forefinger. Cross your needle over the thread. Twist your thread 2 to 4 times around your needle. Transfer to your opposite forefinger and thumb. Draw needle up through the twist, keeping twist secure until all the thread has been pulled through. And this is a quilter's knot.
Tuck your fabric at the edge of the shape and just use a back stitch where the fold lies.
Then continue around the shape, folding and back stitching as you go.
And then make a knot at the end. You can also base with a glue stick I suggested this in my second dollar store sewing hacks video. Just be sure that it's water soluble. And if you use this purple glue stick, it will be easier to see where the glue goes. So here's a tip. You do not want the glue to be on the edge of the paper because that's where the needle's going to go through when you sew your pieces together, and you don't want to gum up your needle. So you put the glue just above the edge. And don't worry about the color because it disappears when it dries. Or you can use these specialty glue pens for better accuracy. Another really common shape is the honeycomb. This is just an elongated hexagon. And they make up this traditional Lucy Boston block. Hexagons can also be cut in half, which can be shaped into larger hexagons. Diamonds come in all shapes and sizes.
A popular one is the 60-degree diamond, as it can be turned into tumbling blocks or a 6-pointed star.
And you make these shapes the same way that you make hexagons. However, you will find that any time that the angle is less than 90 degrees, you will get this tail. And you leave this tail on, don't trim it off. They can fold this way or they can fold that way. And you'll find that you'll need to pay attention to that, but I'll talk about that more in the next step. I know this seems like a choose your own adventure with all the various options, but it really shows how much room there is for personal preference. So you take two pieces, you align them side by side so that the corners match, and then you sew up the side. Let's take this one slow. I started with cotton thread, but found it shredded and broke before I finished the seam, no matter how careful I was. So now I use a double strand of Invisafill. To help get those tiny stitches, you also need a thin needle. I like the size 10, and I use a milliner's needle. It's a little bit longer. Notice the clips that I've used here. This stops the pieces from shifting while you sew, and that means you don't need to clench to hold those pieces together. You can also use these small binder clips or magnets. Make a quilter's knot and thread it between the paper and the fabric into the corner, and do a double stitch to secure.
I am using a whip stitch here, and I'm just picking up a couple of threads on either side.
Then sew up the length of the seam, ending with a double stitch. Now you want to keep your thread short. Not only does the thread break less, but it's a lot easier on your wrist and your elbow. And note how small these stitches are. It's about 16 to 18 per inch. And that means there's a lot of friction on your thread. Note there's two different parts to the whip stitch. You want the short part of the stitch holding the two fabrics together, and then use the whip part to advance up your seam. This makes stitches a lot less visible on the other side. And you'll want to use a thimble. This is the best one for me. It's part silicone and it's made by Clover. But there are metal ones and leather ones out there. You might also find that other parts of your hands and your fingers are tender, so you might need more than one. If thimbles don't work for you, try these stick-on pads or even a Band-Aid. What is a Y-seam? When there's an intersection of three pieces, this is called a Y-seam. Now, Y-seam is one of those scary terms, but truly, once you understand what you need to do, it's a lot simpler. What we are looking is for these three seams to intersect. And though it can be a little bit challenging on a sewing machine, in hand sewing, it's really not that bad. So now we have a third piece.
And we're sewing piece number 1 to piece number 3. And we're just going to sew down the seam until we get to the end, where we'll do a double stitch to secure it in the corner. Then we reorient the pieces so that now we're sewing number 2 to number 3. First, we aligned piece number 2 with piece number 3. We use some clips if necessary to keep it in the same spot. We can also fold the piece of number 1 because the paper is not precious. We start with a double stitch and then just whip stitch down the length of the seam until the end, where we do another double stitch.
Now these hexies are not that fussy, but there will be times when your work gets larger and it will be harder to handle. Use as many clips as you need to stop your work from shifting, and turn your work if necessary. As long as the short part of the whip stitch is holding the fabrics together and you're using the whip part to advance, you really don't need to worry about which way the whip is going. Sometimes on a seam, because it's so fiddly, I have to turn the work back and forth several times, but from the front, you'd never know it. And this is where you need to consider where your tails lie if you have them. You want to avoid them pointing together, because that's just too much bulk in your seam. So fold them so that you have them rotating or lying in the opposite direction. And if you get to sewing your pieces together and you find that you've got it wrong, just lift up your fabric and glue it back down the opposite way. When do you remove the papers? When all the edges of the piece are secured to another piece with stitches, then you can remove the paper. Most of the time they come out easily and you can reuse them. Sometimes I need to get out my stick and give them a nudge. From experience, I don't use anything sharp so I don't damage the fabric. And remember, it's only paper, so it doesn't matter if you have to sacrifice one or two. Just be sure if they rip that the whole piece comes out.
Let me take a moment and tell you about Skillshare. When I am slow sewing, this is another great opportunity to watch a Skillshare class. Most classes are less than 2 hours long and are divided up into smaller chapters. Sometimes it's a class I need to learn more of, sometimes it's totally random. Skillshare has thousands of inspiring classes on design, illustration, video creation, and so much more. They include a combination of video lessons and a class project to test out new ideas and practice. They are also classes for a variety of skill levels, from beginner to advanced. Skillshare is also incredibly affordable when compared to in-person classes and workshops. The first 1,000 people to use this link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare.
Once you're comfortable with the basics, it's time to start fussy cutting by taking pieces of fabric with the same pattern and laying them out in either rows or the round. The symmetry, both rotational and sometimes mirrored, just takes it to a whole new level of spectacular. I recommend that you start small with a pincushion or a pillow. Remember Emma Jones of Vintage Sewing Box? She has a number of simple projects on her website and YouTube channel. I have been making Katia Marek's new hexagon Millefiore for the last 4.5 years. I'm on the last 2 rosettes, so the end is near. If you want to see how it ends, be sure to subscribe. Since you can do English paper piecing in stages, this is an excellent candidate for sewing on the go. I have made a video on how to make a kit and a project bag, and I'll leave a link to it in the notes below. This technique falls under the umbrella of slow sewing. You might find when you're doing slow sewing that your thoughts lighten and lift, or maybe it just gives your brain some space to work through some problems. So it's important to find your own flow using the shapes, fabrics, and patterns that support you. Emma Jones and I had a chance to talk about slow sewing on Karen's Quilt Circle. If you missed it, check it out right here. If you're wanting to try to make your own English paper piece soccer ball, I'll leave a link to that one too. If you like this video, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. Take care, and I'll see you next time.